My name is Iris. I'm 28 years old, and I never thought my own parents would destroy my life for a luxury car. The phone call came while I was cleaning bedpans at the hospital, working my second double shift this week. The bank manager's voice was stern professional, telling me my $45,000 personal loan was overdue. I froze, nearly dropping the phone. I never took out any loan. Then came the words that shattered my world. My parents had co-signed using my information, and the money went straight to a BMW dealership. Before we dive into this unbelievable story of family betrayal and redemption, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. If you've ever experienced family financial drama, hit that like button and subscribe to hear how I survived the worst betrayal imaginable. Trust me, what happens next will leave you speechless, especially when you hear what the bank discovered about my parents' decade-long scheme. Let me take you back 6 months before that devastating phone call. My parents had shown up at my tiny studio apartment with their usual request, though I didn't recognize it as the beginning of my nightmare at the time. They needed my social security number for insurance purposes, they said. Mom clutched her purse nervously while Dad avoided eye contact, something I should have noticed as a red flag. But when your parents ask for help, you don't immediately assume they're planning to commit fraud. Growing up in our household meant understanding one fundamental rule: Dylan could do no wrong. My younger brother, now 26, had been the golden child since birth. While I started working at 14, bagging groceries to buy my school supplies, Dylan got everything handed to him on a silver platter. He dropped out of college 3 times, each failure met with sympathy and fresh starts funded by our parents. Meanwhile, I worked 3 jobs to put myself through nursing school, never once asking for financial help, because I knew the answer would be lectures about being more like my ambitious brother. The irony wasn't lost on me as I handed over my information that day. Here I was, living in a 400-square-foot apartment with peeling paint and a radiator that barely worked, while Dylan lived rent-free in our parents' newly renovated basement. They'd spent $30,000 converting it into what essentially became his personal gaming paradise. He hadn't worked in 2 years, claiming he was developing some app that would make him rich. The only development I ever saw was his growing collection of gaming consoles and his expanding waistline from the gourmet meals Mom delivered to his door 3 times a day. 2 weeks before the insurance request, my parents had cornered me at Sunday dinner with another familiar refrain. Dylan was going through a temporary financial situation. They explained as if being unemployed for 2 years was temporary. They wanted me to help out just this once, though their definition of once seemed to reset every few months. I offered to help him update his resume, maybe use my hospital connections to get him an entry-level job. The look of horror on their faces told me everything I needed to know about their actual intentions. They didn't want Dylan to work. They wanted me to fund his lifestyle. The manipulation was always subtle, wrapped in guilt and family obligation. Mom would sigh dramatically about how some children understood the importance of family, while others only thought of themselves. Dad would mention how disappointed my late grandmother would be that I wasn't helping my brother in his time of need. They conveniently forgot that Grandma had worked until she was 75 and believed everyone should earn their own way. They'd rewritten history to suit their narrative, painting me as the selfish daughter who abandoned family values. What I didn't know during those seemingly innocent requests was that my parents had already set their plan in motion. While I was working back-to-back shifts, barely sleeping, trying to save enough to maybe move to a better neighborhood, they were at the BMW dealership with Dylan test driving cars he couldn't afford. The salesperson later told investigators that my parents seemed confident about financing, mentioning their daughter's excellent credit score multiple times. Dylan had already picked out the fully loaded model in metallic blue, adding every possible upgrade, because as he told the salesperson, his sister wouldn't want him driving anything basic. The first public betrayal came through Facebook. I was on my lunch break, exhausted from a particularly difficult shift, when my phone started buzzing with notifications. Dylan had posted photos of himself leaning against a brand new BMW keys, dangling from his fingers with the caption, "Hard work pays off. Thanks to everyone who believed in my business vision, the sky's the limit now." The comments were full of congratulations from relatives and family friends praising his success and entrepreneurial spirit. My aunt commented that it was wonderful to see him thriving, while others in the family struggled with chemical dependencies. That comment stopped me cold. I called my cousin Emma immediately, demanding to know what she'd heard. Her uncomfortable silence told me everything before she finally admitted that my parents had been telling everyone I was struggling with addiction. According to them, that's why I worked so many hours, lived in a bad neighborhood, and couldn't help the family financially. They'd created an elaborate fiction where I was one step away from rock bottom, spending all my money on drugs while they tried desperately to help me. The confrontation with my parents happened over the phone because I couldn't trust myself to see them in person. Mom answered with her fake, cheerful voice, the one she used when she knew she'd done something wrong, but hoped to brazen through it. I asked about the BMW, about the stories they were spreading. She launched into a practiced speech about how they were just trying to help Dylan get on his feet, how a reliable car would help him with his business. When I pressed about the addiction lies, she pivoted to tears, claiming I was attacking her for caring about both her children equally. Dad took the phone, then his voice hard with the authority he'd always used to shut down my objections as a child. I was being dramatic, he said. Family helps family, and if I was too selfish to understand that maybe I had bigger problems than they'd told people. The threat was clear: fall in line, or they'd make the lies even worse. When I mentioned my excellent credit score and how hard I'd worked to build it, he actually laughed. Credit scores don't matter between family, he said, unless you're planning to abandon us entirely. The call ended with them dismissing every concern I raised. I was overreacting, being selfish, thinking only of myself, while poor Dylan struggled to build his future. They painted themselves as devoted parents, trying to help their children equally, while I was the ungrateful daughter who measured family love in dollar signs. Mom even managed to work in how this stress was affecting her blood pressure, a familiar guilt trip she deployed whenever I pushed back against their demands. 3 days later, the bank called. The loan officer's words felt like ice water in my veins as she explained that I'd taken out a $45,000 personal loan co-signed by my parents with the funds directly transferred to a luxury car dealership. The payments were already overdue because the loan had been taken out 2 months ago, and not a single payment had been made. My parents had listed my work address for correspondence, but somehow those notices never reached me. The officer mentioned that without immediate payment, they would begin legal proceedings within 30 days. My hands shook as I pulled up my credit report on my phone, something I hadn't done in months because I'd been so careful with my finances. The number that appeared made me physically ill. My once pristine 780 credit score had plummeted to 490. Multiple credit cards I'd never opened showed maximum balances. Store cards, travel cards, even a home equity line of credit against an address I'd never lived at. My entire financial identity had been systematically destroyed while I was too busy working to notice. The lawyer's office smelled like old leather and disappointment. I'd found Margaret Chen through a coworker's recommendation, using my last $2,000 in savings to retain her services. She specialized in identity theft cases, and the look on her face as she reviewed my documents told me this was worse than even I had imagined. Her fingers moved efficiently through the papers, occasionally pausing to make notes, each pause making my heart sink further. "This is systematic fraud," she said, finally removing her glasses to look at me directly. "The loan for the car is just the tip of the iceberg. Your parents have been building this scheme for at least 2 years, possibly longer." She spread out the credit reports like evidence at a crime scene, which I suppose they were. 3 major credit cards, all opened within the last 24 months, all with my information, but statements going to a P.O. box I'd never heard of. The total damage came to $73,000, not including interest and penalties. Margaret explained that the pattern suggested planning and knowledge of the system. They'd started small, a store card here and there, making minimum payments to keep the accounts active while building toward bigger targets. The car loan was their grand finale, the big score they'd been working toward. What made it worse was the paper trail showing Dylan's involvement. His name appeared as an authorized user on several cards, and there were multiple big-ticket purchases that coincided with his social media posts about new electronics, designer clothes, and expensive nights out. The real knife to the heart came when Margaret pulled up property records. My grandmother's house, the one where I'd spent every summer as a child, where she'd taught me to bake and told me stories about her own struggles coming to America, with nothing was supposed to come to me. Grandma had been very specific in her will about that. She'd even told me before she died, holding my hand and saying she wanted me to have a real home, a place where I could build the life she knew I deserved. But the records showed my parents as the sole owners, collecting $1,200 monthly in rent while I struggled to pay for my studio apartment. I called Aunt Grace that night, Grandma's younger sister who lived across the country. She was the only family member who'd ever stood up to my parents, which had resulted in years of strained relationships. Her reaction to my call was immediate and furious. "I knew something was wrong when they wouldn't let me see the will," she said. "Your grandmother made me promise to make sure you got that house. She knew what your parents were like, even if she never said it out loud." Grace revealed more pieces of the puzzle. My parents had been telling the extended family that I was spiraling into addiction for over a year. They'd shown up to family gatherings with tears in their eyes, accepting comfort and money from relatives who wanted to help their troubled daughter. Several family members had given them cash to get me help, money that never made it anywhere near me. The fiction was elaborate, complete with stories of interventions I'd refused and rehab facilities I'd run away from. The conversation was interrupted by a text from my cousin Emma. "You need to see this," was all it said, followed by an audio file. I played it on speaker so Aunt Grace could hear. It was my parents' voices recorded at what sounded like a recent family barbecue. They were laughing with my uncle about how easy it had been to use my information, how I was too busy with my little nursing job to notice anything. My mother's voice was particularly chilling as she said, "She owes us anyway after everything we've done for her." This is just evening the score. Emma texted again, explaining she'd started recording after overhearing other conversations where they'd discussed their plans. She had 3 more recordings, including one where Dylan bragged about picking out his car, using Iris's loan, and laughing about how I'd probably thank him once his app made millions. The casualness of their betrayal, the complete lack of remorse made me physically sick. These were the people who were supposed to protect me, who claimed family was everything. The next morning brought another blow. My boss Janet called me into her office with the head of HR present. The hospital had run a routine financial background check as part of a new security protocol, and my destroyed credit had raised red flags. Janet looked sympathetic but explained that hospital policy was strict about employees with significant financial distress, especially those with access to medications and patient information. I had 30 days to resolve the issues or face termination. The irony wasn't lost on me that my parents' actions might cost me the job I'd worked so hard to get, the career I'd sacrificed everything to build. Dylan chose that moment to text me his message, dripping with entitlement and condescension. "Mom says you're being dramatic about the car thing. It's not that big a deal, Iris. Family helps family. Maybe if you weren't so selfish, you'd understand. BTW, the car drives amazing. When my app launches, it'll pay you back with interest. Stop making Mom cry." I screenshot the message and forwarded it to Margaret, more evidence for our growing file. She'd already started the process of filing fraud alerts with the credit bureaus and preparing criminal charges. But she warned me this was going to get uglier before it got better. "People who are willing to steal from their own children rarely go down without a fight," she said. "You need to be prepared for them to escalate." As if on cue, I returned to my apartment that evening to find an eviction notice on my door. My landlord had received an anonymous tip about my financial situation and drug problems. Despite my perfect rental history, he wanted me out within the week, citing concerns about the building's reputation. The timing wasn't coincidental. My parents were launching a preemptive strike, trying to destabilize me before I could fight back. The next betrayal came from an unexpected source. Monica, my best friend since nursing school, called to say she needed to talk. We met at our usual coffee shop, but something was off. She could barely make eye contact as she explained that my parents had approached her offering to pay off her student loans if she'd support their version of events. They wanted her to sign an affidavit stating she'd witnessed my drug use and erratic behavior. To her credit, she was telling me instead of taking the money, but the fact that she'd even considered it for a moment fractured something between us that would never fully heal. My life was unraveling thread by thread, each pull orchestrated by the people who'd given me life. The storage unit where I kept my grandmother's things, the few items I'd managed to save after her death, had been broken into. The manager showed me security footage of my parents using a key. I didn't know they had loading boxes into their car. Grandma's jewelry, the photo albums, her handwritten recipes, all gone. When I called to confront them, my father answered with mock innocence. "We were just keeping family heirlooms safe," he said. "You know, since you're having such troubles right now, wouldn't want them to end up sold for drug money." Margaret filed for an emergency restraining order, but my parents had one more card to play. They went to the police first, filing a report that I'd threatened them. The officers who showed up at the hospital to arrest me were apologetic but firm. Hospital security watched as I was handcuffed in front of my colleagues, my scrubs replaced with County Jail Orange. The charges were eventually dropped when Margaret provided evidence of the false report, but the damage to my reputation was done. Some mud once thrown always sticks. As I sat in my car that night, my apartment already vacated my job. Hanging by a thread, my phone lit up with messages from extended family members who'd heard my parents' latest version of events. According to them, I'd attacked them when they tried to stage an intervention, forcing them to call the police for their own safety. The fiction was becoming more elaborate, more desperate, but it was working. I was becoming the villain in my own story, watching helplessly as my parents rewrote reality to suit their needs. Social media became a battlefield I never wanted to enter. My mother, who had barely understood Facebook a year ago, suddenly became a master of digital manipulation. The posts started subtly prayer requests for her struggling daughter. and inspirational quotes about loving children through their darkest moments. But they quickly escalated into full character assassination, complete with carefully edited screenshots of text conversations where my reasonable responses were cropped to look like unhinged rants. The comment sections became echo chambers of sympathy for my parents and condemnation for me. Family friends I'd known since childhood posted about how they'd always sensed something was off about me, how my parents were saints for not giving up. Local church members organized meal trains for my suffering parents while I rationed ramen noodles in my car. The digital mob had decided my guilt without ever hearing my side, and my parents fed them new outrages daily. Then came the cruelest betrayal yet. Monica, despite her earlier hesitation, had taken my parents' money. She posted a long, emotional statement about watching her best friend descend into addiction, complete with fabricated stories of finding me passed out and lending me money I'd never repaid. The post went viral in our nursing community, shared by colleagues who thought they were supporting addiction awareness. $30,000 had bought my parents a star witness, and they made sure everyone knew it. Living in my car wasn't the lowest point, though it felt like it at the time. I'd found a safe parking lot behind a 24-hour grocery store where the security guard, an elderly man named Carl, pretended not to notice me sleeping there. I kept my scrubs in a gym bag, showering at the hospital, between shifts, trying to maintain the illusion of normalcy. But word had spread about my situation, and the whispers followed me down every corridor. Some colleagues crossed hallways to avoid me, as if financial fraud was contagious. The morning Dylan crashed the BMW changed everything. He'd been drinking, celebrating some imaginary business milestone when he wrapped the car around a median on the interstate. The police report showed he was twice the legal limit, but that didn't stop my parents from calling me screaming that I needed to pay for the repairs. The insurance wouldn't cover drunk driving, and the $45,000 car was totaled. Somehow this too was my fault. I should have bought him a safer car, they said. I should have known he was under stress from building his business. The hospital suspension came 2 days later. An anonymous complaint had been filed suggesting I might be diverting medications. The investigation would take weeks, they explained, and in the meantime, I couldn't work. No work meant no income. No income meant no lawyer fees. No gas money, no food. My parents had orchestrated the perfect storm, each move calculated to push me closer to the edge. Without my job, I was just another sob story, exactly the image they'd been painting for months. Jake, my ex-boyfriend from 2 years ago, called me out of the blue. We'd ended things amicably when he'd moved for work, staying friendly but distant. His voice was strained as he explained that my parents had contacted him, offering him money to provide a statement about my unstable behavior during our relationship. They wanted him to say he'd left because of my addiction issues, that he'd tried to help, but I'd refused. He was calling to warn me and to let me know he'd told them to go to hell. But how many others had they approached who hadn't called to tell me? My breaking point almost came when Max got sick. The scruffy terrier mix had been my only constant companion through everything, sleeping in the car with me. His warm presence, the only comfort in the cold nights. When he stopped eating and started whimpering, I knew something was seriously wrong. The emergency vet diagnosed an intestinal blockage that required immediate surgery, $3,000 I didn't have. I held him in the parking lot, sobbing, preparing to say goodbye when the vet tech quietly slipped me a card for a program that helped people in crisis. They'd work out a payment plan, she said, her eyes kind. Nobody should lose their family because of money, she whispered. While I was at the vet, my parents made their boldest move yet. They'd broken into my storage unit again, this time taking everything. But it wasn't just about theft anymore. They'd planted evidence of drug paraphernalia among my grandmother's things, then called the police to report suspicious activity. The unit manager called to warn me, having reviewed the security footage that clearly showed them placing the items. He'd already told the police the truth, but the message was clear: they were willing to manufacture criminal evidence to destroy me. Margaret had been building our case methodically, but she needed more evidence of my parents' broader pattern of behavior. She suggested I reach out to extended family members who might have had similar experiences. The first person I called was Uncle Robert, my father's estranged brother. He'd moved across the country 20 years ago and rarely spoke to the family. His reaction to my story was immediate recognition. "They did the same thing to me," he said quietly. "Took out business loans in my name, destroyed my credit. I couldn't prove it was them, so I just left. I should have warned you." The scope of my parents' deceptions was staggering. Robert sent me documents from 2 decades ago showing the same pattern: forged signatures, mysterious loans, character assassination when he tried to fight back. He'd lost his marriage and his business before finally accepting defeat and starting over 3,000 miles away. "The only way I found peace," he said, "was to accept that they were never really my family. Parasites maybe, but not family. As I sat in Carl's security office that night, using his phone to call Margaret because mine had been shut off for non-payment, I felt something shift inside me. The despair that had been drowning me crystallized into something harder, sharper. My parents had taken everything they could, my home, my job, my reputation, my family. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd left me with nothing left to lose. And a person with nothing left to lose is dangerous in ways they couldn't imagine. Margaret's voice was energized when she answered. "I've been trying to reach you all day," she said. "We found something. Your cousin Emma's recordings, combined with the evidence from the storage unit and your uncle's documentation, it's enough. The FBI wants to talk to you. This isn't just identity theft anymore. It's a pattern of interstate fraud spanning decades. Your parents are about to learn what real consequences look like." I looked at Max, bandaged, but wagging his tail weakly in his carrier, at Carl, who'd shown me more kindness than my blood relatives, at the stack of evidence I'd been compiling in a borrowed folder. 28 years of being the good daughter, the responsible one, the one who never caused trouble, and it had all led to this moment. They wanted a villain. They were about to meet one armed with truth and backed by federal prosecutors. The war for my life was about to begin in earnest, and I was finally ready to fight. The morning after my night in Carl's office, everything changed because of an unlikely guardian angel. Mrs. Chen had been my patient 6 months earlier, a 75-year-old retired teacher recovering from hip surgery. She'd noticed me crying in the break room, and with the no-nonsense attitude that had probably terrified and inspired decades of students, demanded to know what was wrong. When I finished explaining my situation, she made a phone call that would alter the trajectory of my fight for justice. "My son William is a prosecutor," she said simply. "He specializes in financial crimes. You're going to stay in my guest house, and we're going to fix this mess." Her tone brooked no argument, and honestly, I was too exhausted to try. Within hours, I had a safe place to sleep, Max had a yard to recover in, and I had a legal team that made my parents' worst nightmares look like pleasant dreams. William Chen had the kind of quiet intensity that made witnesses sweat and defendants plead guilty just to avoid trial. David from work had been watching my situation unfold with growing concern. As a financial advisor who moonlighted at the hospital to pay off his own student loans, he understood both the medical and monetary aspects of my crisis. When he heard about my suspension, he volunteered his expertise to trace the labyrinth of fraud my parents had created. What he found over the next 72 hours of intensive investigation shocked even William. My parents hadn't just stolen my identity, they'd created an entire financial ecosystem of fraud involving multiple victims across state lines. The evidence David uncovered was damning. My parents had done this before, not just to Uncle Robert, but to at least 3 other family members over the years. They'd refined their technique with each victim, learning from mistakes, perfecting their manipulation tactics. They kept meticulous records hidden in a safety deposit box they didn't know was listed on one of the fraudulent accounts. David found it through careful analysis of bank statements, a digital breadcrumb trail leading to their hoard of evidence against themselves. Ms. Rodriguez, my high school AP English teacher, reached out after seeing the social media firestorm. She'd taught me to write, to think critically, to question everything, and she wasn't about to let her star pupil be destroyed by lies. She began compiling character references from years of teachers, counselors, and administrators who remembered the real me, the girl who tutored classmates for free, who worked weekends to buy supplies for younger students, who wrote essays about integrity and justice that made teachers cry. Her folder of testimonials grew daily, each one a brick in the wall of truth I was building against my parents' fiction. The identity theft support group met in the basement of a community center every Tuesday night. I'd resisted going at first too proud or too broken to admit I needed help processing the emotional devastation alongside the financial. But when I finally walked through those doors, I found my tribe. There was James, whose ex-wife had destroyed his credit in revenge. Sandra, whose adult son had funded a gambling addiction with her information. Marcus, whose business partner had left him with nothing but debt and lawsuits. We were all refugees from trust, learning to rebuild our lives one small victory at a time. The group became my emotional lifeline as William and his team built the legal case. They understood the particular grief of familial betrayal the way it rewired your brain to question every memory, every kind gesture, every claimed moment of love. We developed a dark humor about our situations, calling ourselves the Identity Theft Survivors Club, and joking that we should get merit badges for things like first successful dispute or survive at a family gathering without committing murder. It was either laugh or scream, and we'd all done enough screaming. William's investigation revealed the 4th major betrayal in a particularly cruel twist. My Aunt Susan, my mother's own sister, had been helping them all along. She worked at a bank and had been using her position to facilitate the fraud, providing insider information about how to maximize credit applications and avoid detection. The FBI added her to their investigation, and suddenly my family tree looked more like a criminal organization chart. William showed me the connections mapped out on his office wall, and it resembled something from a mafia movie more than a family portrait. The discovery process unearthed more than just financial crimes. As William's team dug deeper, they found evidence of tax fraud, insurance fraud, and benefits fraud spanning 15 years. My parents had claimed me as a dependent long after I'd moved out, collected benefits meant for low-income families while hiding assets, and even filed false insurance claims using my information. Each revelation felt like another cut, but also like validation. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't overreacting. I was the victim of career criminals who happened to share my DNA. David's financial archaeology revealed the full scope of their hidden assets. While they'd been crying poverty to relatives claiming they could barely afford to help Dylan, they owned a vacation property in Florida, had investment accounts totaling over $200,000, and had been systematically moving money offshore. The BMW wasn't just a car. It was a symbol of their contempt for me buying luxury with my credit while I slept in parking lots. The irony that their greed had finally exposed them wasn't lost on anyone. Mrs. Chen became more than just a landlord. She became the grandmother I'd lost. She cooked me meals when I was too exhausted from legal meetings to feed myself, sat with Max when I had to testify before the grand jury, and offered the kind of unconditional support I'd never actually received from my biological family. Real family, she told me one evening over tea, is chosen by actions not assigned by blood. Your parents chose to be criminals. I choose to be your family. The turning point in building our case came when Dylan, facing his own legal troubles from the DUI and mounting evidence of his participation in the fraud, decided to flip on our parents. William had offered him a plea deal, full cooperation in exchange for reduced charges. The spoiled golden child, faced with the prospect of actual consequences for the first time in his life, folded like a cheap suit. His testimony revealed not just what they'd done, but how they'd planned it, laughed about it, celebrated each successful theft as a victory over my selfishness. William's team was thorough beyond anything I could have imagined. They brought in forensic accountants who traced every penny, interviewed every witness, built a timeline that showed systematic fraud dating back to when I was in high school. They found forged permission slips for credit cards in my name from when I was barely 18, applications for store cards filed while I was taking my nursing boards, a pattern of exploitation that had been invisible to me because I'd trusted the people hurting me. James from the support group had become a closer friend as we navigated our parallel journeys. His ex-wife's trial was 2 weeks before my parents', and I sat in the courtroom to support him as she was sentenced to 3 years in prison. Watching him testify, seeing the pain and strength in his voice as he detailed the destruction she'd caused, prepared me for my own moment of truth. We had dinner afterward, two broken people finding solidarity in survival, and he gave me advice that would carry me through. Don't let them see you cry in court. Save the tears for after. In that room, you're not their daughter. You're their victim seeking justice. The support system that had formed around me was a stark contrast to the family I'd lost. My new nursing supervisor, who'd hired me at a different hospital after my suspension was lifted, accommodated every court date without question. Carl, the security guard, sent me a card saying he was proud of me. Even my new landlord, aware of my situation, refused to run a credit check, saying, "Good people deserve second chances, especially when the first chance was stolen." These strangers showed me more genuine care than my parents ever had. As the trial date approached, I had a moment of clarity during a support group meeting. Sandra was sharing how her son had tried to manipulate her into dropping charges, using every emotional weapon in his arsenal. "But I realized," she said, "that protecting him from consequences wasn't love. It was enabling. Real love means letting people face what they've done." I thought about all the times I'd covered for Dylan, made excuses for my parents, accepted their version of family loyalty. That wasn't love. It was complicity in my own destruction. William presented me with the final count of charges against my parents, 43 federal counts including wire fraud, mail fraud, identity theft, conspiracy, and money laundering. Against Dylan, 12 counts with the possibility of reduction based on cooperation. Against Aunt Susan, 21 counts including bank fraud and conspiracy. The numbers felt surreal, like something from a crime show, rather than my life. But as William reminded me, these weren't just numbers. Each count represented a choice they'd made to hurt me a moment when they could have stopped, but chose greed instead. The night before trial, my support system gathered at Mrs. Chen's house. William and his team went over my testimony one final time while Mrs. Chen cooked enough food to feed an army. David brought financial charts that would be used as evidence, color-coded and meticulously organized. Ms. Rodriguez had driven in to be a character witness, bringing letters from 24 other teachers. James was there for moral support, having become my anchor through the storm. Even Margaret, my first lawyer, who'd handed the case to William when it became federal, showed up with words of encouragement. Looking around that table, I realized I'd lost a biological family, but gained a chosen one. These people had shown up when it mattered, fought for me when I couldn't fight for myself, believed in me when the world was being told I was worthless. My parents had tried to destroy me with their greed, but instead they'd inadvertently given me something priceless, the knowledge of what real family looked like. It wasn't blood or obligation or guilt. It was choice repeated daily to show up for each other. Tomorrow I would walk into that courtroom not as a victim, but as a survivor, surrounded by people who'd helped me reclaim my life. My parents were about to learn that their daughter, the one they'd dismissed as weak and exploitable, had become someone far stronger than they'd ever imagined. The federal courthouse in downtown stood like a fortress of justice, its marble steps leading to massive doors that would open onto my day of reckoning. William had prepped me extensively, but nothing could have prepared me for the moment I filed criminal charges against my own parents. The clerk who processed the paperwork looked at me with a mixture of sympathy and respect, stamping each document with a finality that echoed through the quiet office. There was no going back now, and I didn't want to. The FBI's involvement transformed everything from a family dispute into a federal case that made local news. Agent Sarah Martinez led the financial crimes unit assigned to my case, and her team's efficiency was breathtaking. Within days of taking over, they'd frozen my parents' assets, executed search warrants on their home, and uncovered evidence that even William hadn't anticipated. The vacation property in Florida had been purchased with fraudulent loans. The investment accounts contained money stolen from other relatives. The scope kept expanding like a cancer diagnosis, each test revealing more disease. My parents' first reaction was predictable, complete denial, wrapped in tears and manipulation. They went to their church, our extended family, anyone who would listen, claiming I was mentally unstable and vengeful over childhood grievances. But the FBI raids had been visible to neighbors, the asset freezes public record, and slowly their carefully constructed image began to crack. The same people who'd been sending them sympathy casseroles started asking uncomfortable questions about federal agents and frozen bank accounts. Then came the unexpected gift of public vindication. A local investigative journalist, intrigued by the federal case, started digging into my story. She interviewed William, examined court documents, and most importantly, she verified my parents' pattern of lies. Her article titled, "The Daughter They Tried to Destroy," went viral within hours. Suddenly, my inbox filled with messages from other victims of family financial abuse, sharing their stories, offering support. The narrative my parents had controlled for so long spun wildly out of their grasp. The social media tide turned with stunning speed. The same platforms they'd used to destroy me became their judgment hall. People who'd shared their posts about my supposed addiction started deleting them, posting apologies, expressing horror at being manipulated. Monica tried to retract her statement, claiming my parents had coerced her, but the damage to her credibility was complete. She'd taken $30,000 to lie about her best friend. Some betrayals can't be walked back. The GoFundMe campaign, started by James and the support group, exceeded all expectations. Within a week, we'd raised $30,000 for my legal fees and living expenses. People I'd never met contributed, sharing their own stories of family betrayal in the comments. A nurse from across the country wrote, "I know what it's like to be the responsible one in a toxic family. Stay strong." A grandmother from Texas sent $5 with a note. "It's not much, but it's sent with love. From someone who understands." The generosity of strangers stood in stark contrast to the greed of blood relatives. My parents' church, First Baptist of Riverside, had been their social stronghold for 20 years. They'd held positions of leadership, my mother running the women's ministry, my father serving as a deacon. The news of federal fraud charges created a scandal that rocked the congregation. Pastor Williams, who'd counseled me as a teenager, called me personally to apologize. "We failed you," he said simply. "We believed their lies over your truth. That's on us." The church board voted unanimously to remove them from all positions and began their own investigation into whether church funds had been misused. Dylan's betrayal of our parents became the most dramatic moment of the investigation. Facing federal charges and the loss of everything he'd taken for granted, he didn't just cooperate. He volunteered information prosecutors hadn't even asked for. He revealed the planning sessions where they'd discussed using my credit, the jokes they'd made about my little nursing job, the celebration dinner they'd had after successfully getting the car loan. His testimony painted a picture of calculated cruelty that made even hardened FBI agents shake their heads in disgust. The revelation that sent shockwaves through the investigation came from Dylan's phone records. He'd been secretly recording conversations with our parents for months, not out of conscience, but as insurance, in case they tried to blame everything on him. Those recordings captured them discussing not just my identity theft, but plans to do the same to my cousins once they'd maxed out Iris's potential. They laughed about how easy it was to manipulate family loyalty, how blood relationships created the perfect cover for crime. The FBI added conspiracy charges that carried mandatory minimum sentences. My father's employer, a respected accounting firm where he'd worked for 15 years, launched their own investigation when the federal charges became public. What they found ended his career instantly. He'd been using his position to gather information about identity theft detection, essentially learning how to be a better criminal on company time. Several clients reported suspicious activity after meeting with him, leading to additional charges and civil lawsuits. The man who'd lectured me about professional responsibility lost his CPA license and faced personal bankruptcy. Mother's downfall was equally spectacular. Her arrest happened at the elementary school where she worked as an administrator in full view of parents and staff. The images of her being led away in handcuffs spread across social media like wildfire, each share accompanied by comments from parents whose children she'd supposedly counseled. The school board placed her on immediate suspension, later converting it to termination when the full extent of the charges became clear. The woman who'd built her identity on being a pillar of the community became its most notorious pariah. The discovery phase of the trial produced one revelation after another. Emails between my parents discussing their retirement plan, funded by my credit, text messages joking about my stupidity for trusting them, financial records showing they'd been living well beyond their supposed means for years, all funded by fraud. But the most damaging evidence came from their own home, a notebook where my mother had kept detailed records of every scam, every forged document, every stolen penny, like a twisted accounting of their parental betrayal. When their assets were frozen, the true extent of their hidden wealth shocked everyone, including me. While I'd been sleeping in my car, they had over $200,000 in various accounts. While I'd been rationing ramen, they'd been taking weekend trips to wine country. While I'd nearly lost Max because I couldn't afford his surgery, they'd spent $15,000 on a swimming pool. The contrast between their claimed poverty and actual wealth became a powerful piece of evidence showing consciousness of guilt and greed rather than need. Their attempts at emotional manipulation intensified as trial approached. Letters arrived through their lawyer, each one a masterpiece of gaslighting and guilt. They were sorry I'd misunderstood their intentions. They hoped we could work through this as a family. They were praying for my healing from whatever had caused this vindictive behavior. William advised me to keep the letters as evidence of their continued refusal to accept responsibility, but I couldn't read them. Mrs. Chen did summarizing their contents with the clinical detachment of someone analyzing specimens of particular nasty bacteria. The witness list for the prosecution read like a directory of my life. Teachers, co-workers, extended family members who'd discovered they'd also been victimized. Even the car dealership manager who'd become suspicious of the transaction but had been overruled by sales pressure. Each person represented a moment when someone had seen the truth despite my parents' lies. Ms. Rodriguez would testify about the hard-working student she'd known. David would present the financial evidence he'd compiled. James would speak as a character witness who'd seen me at my lowest and watched me fight back. The week before trial, something unexpected happened. Judge Harrison, reviewing the case, suggested mediation. Not to avoid trial, but to see if my parents would accept responsibility and avoid the spectacle of a full federal trial. The mediation session was scheduled, and I agreed to attend, not out of hope for reconciliation, but to look them in the eyes one last time as their daughter before I became their prosecutor's star witness. The meeting took place in a sterile conference room at the federal building. My parents sat across from me, their expensive lawyers paid for, with stolen money flanking them. They looked smaller than I remembered, diminished by the weight of consequences they'd never expected to face. My father's commanding presence had shrunk to defensive posturing. My mother's perfectly styled facade had cracked, showing the desperate woman beneath. Dylan sat at the far end, avoiding everyone's eyes, the golden child tarnished beyond recognition. When the mediator asked if they had anything to say to me, my mother launched into a performance worthy of an Oscar. Tears, proclamations of love, claims that everything they'd done was for the family. She reached across the table as if to take my hands, and I pulled back the gesture sharp with finality. My father tried his old authority, suggesting I was overreacting, that family didn't do this to each other. The irony of that statement hung in the air like a toxic cloud. I spoke only once during the session, my voice steady and clear. You had countless opportunities to stop. Every forged signature, every fraudulent application, every lie you told about me, those were choices. You chose greed over your daughter. You chose luxury over my survival. You chose to destroy me rather than admit your own failures. Now you get to choose whether to accept a plea deal or face trial. But you don't get to choose my forgiveness. That's not for sale. They refused the plea deal, convinced they could manipulate a jury like they'd manipulated everyone else. William smiled grimly when we left the courthouse. They just made our job easier, he said. Juries don't like parents who steal from their children. They really don't like parents who show no remorse. As we walked to the car, Agent Martinez called with news. They'd found evidence of my parents planning to flee the country tickets to a non-extradition country, purchased with a credit card in my name they'd somehow hidden from the initial investigation. Bail would be revoked. They'd await trial from federal custody. That night, the support group met for our regular session. I shared the day's events, the strange mixture of satisfaction and sadness that came with watching my parents refuse their last chance at mercy. Sandra hugged me, understanding without words the particular grief of accepting your family members are strangers who happen to share your genes. Marcus raised his coffee cup in a toast. To Iris, who fought back and won. We all raised our cups, a room full of survivors, celebrating not revenge but justice. Tomorrow would bring more battles, but tonight we acknowledged how far we'd come from being victims to being warriors in our own stories. The trial date arrived with the weight of finality, set for a Monday morning in September when the air still held summer's warmth but carried autumn's promise of change. I dressed carefully in the navy suit Mrs. Chen had insisted on buying me professional armor for the battle ahead. William had coached me extensively on courtroom demeanor, but nothing could prepare me for the moment I walked into that federal courtroom and saw my parents in orange jumpsuits shackled at wrists and ankles, their bail revoked after the flight risk discovery. The gallery was packed with reporters, family members, and curious observers drawn by the sensational nature of the case. Parents stealing their daughter's identity, destroying her life for luxury cars and swimming pools made for irresistible headlines. I took my seat behind the prosecution table, James on one side, Mrs. Chen on the other, my chosen family forming a protective barrier against the stares and whispers. Aunt Grace had flown in from Seattle, her presence a reminder that not all family was toxic. Jury selection had taken 2 days, William carefully weeding out anyone who might be swayed by my parents' elderly appearance or claims of family loyalty. The final 12 included a teacher who understood living paycheck to paycheck, a small business owner who'd been scammed by a partner, and a grandmother raising her grandchild because her own daughter had chosen drugs over responsibility. They looked at my parents with expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed disgust as the charges were read, 43 counts that took the clerk 10 minutes to get through. The prosecution's opening statement, delivered by William with surgical precision, laid out the case like a roadmap of destruction. He showed the jury photos of me sleeping in my car while displaying bank statements showing my parents' luxury purchases. He explained the systematic nature of the fraud, how they'd refined their techniques over decades of victimizing family members. By the time he finished, several jurors were taking notes, their faces hardening with each revealed deception. The defense's strategy became clear immediately. Paint me as an ungrateful daughter seeking revenge for imagined childhood slights. My parents' attorney, a silver-haired man who specialized in white-collar crime, suggested I'd fabricated evidence, manipulated Dylan into lying, turned a family misunderstanding into a federal case. He portrayed my parents as loving, but perhaps misguided, trying to help their troubled daughter, who'd rejected their support. It was exactly what William had predicted and exactly why we'd prepared so thoroughly. The evidence phase began with Agent Martinez walking the jury through the financial crimes in excruciating detail. Charts showed the timeline of fraud, each forged document blown up on screens for the jury to examine. The BMW purchase documents with my forged signature. Credit applications filed while I was working double shifts. The notebook from my mother's closet where she'd tracked their crimes like a twisted accountant. The jury's expressions grew darker with each piece of evidence, one woman shaking her head as the total theft amount was displayed $73,000, not including interest and destroyed credit. Then came the witnesses. Ms. Rodriguez testified about the students she'd known, showing report cards and essays I'd written about integrity and hard work. Her voice broke when she described seeing me on social media, being portrayed as an addict, knowing it was lies, but not understanding why my parents would spread such poison. The car dealership manager explained his suspicions about the sale, how my parents had insisted everything was legitimate, while Dylan picked out the most expensive options available. David's testimony turned technical, but devastating. He'd created visual representations of the fraud's impact on my life, showing how each theft had cascaded into larger consequences. Lost job opportunities due to credit checks, inability to secure housing. the compound interest accumulating daily. He calculated that my parents' actions would cost me over $300,000 over my lifetime in higher interest rates and lost opportunities. The numbers were stark, undeniable, and several jurors were visibly angry by the time he finished. The most dramatic moment came when Dylan took the stand. My brother, the golden child who'd never faced consequences, looked like a deflated balloon in his plea deal suit. His testimony was devastating in its casual cruelty. He described family dinners where they'd laughed about using my credit, calling me stupid for not noticing. He revealed that the BMW hadn't been his first choice. He'd wanted a Tesla, but they'd reached my credit limit. He admitted to using the credit cards himself, buying gaming systems and designer clothes while I worked overtime to afford groceries. Under cross-examination, Dylan fell apart. The defense attorney tried to paint him as a manipulated son, turning on his parents for a deal, but Dylan's entitled attitude broke through. When asked why he'd participated, he shrugged and said, "They told me Iris owed us. She got all the brains, went to college, had a good job. This was just evening things out." The jury's disgust was palpable. One man actually turned away, unable to look at my brother, explaining why he deserved to steal from me. My mother's sister Susan's testimony revealed the depth of the conspiracy. She'd used her position at the bank to facilitate the fraud, teaching my parents how to maximize credit applications and avoid detection. Her plea deal required full cooperation, and she delivered, explaining how they'd planned to move to other family members once they'd exhausted my credit. The jury learned about Uncle Robert, driven across the country by their theft, about cousins who'd lost savings to mysterious loans, about a pattern of predation that spanned decades. When I took the stand, the courtroom fell silent. William had prepared me for this moment, but facing my parents while recounting their betrayal felt like performing surgery on myself without anesthesia. I spoke about discovering the fraud through a bank call, about sleeping in my car while they enjoyed their swimming pool, about losing my job, my home, my reputation while they played the victims. I kept my voice steady, letting the facts speak louder than emotions. But when I described almost losing Max because I couldn't afford his surgery, tears finally came. The cross-examination was brutal. The defense attorney tried every trick, suggesting I was mentally unstable, that I'd misunderstood family loans, that I was seeking attention and money through false accusations. But William had prepared me for every attack. I had receipts, recordings, documents. When the lawyer suggested I'd manipulated evidence, I calmly pointed out that the FBI's forensic accountants had verified everything independently. When he implied I was vindictive, I listed the opportunities I'd given my parents to stop to apologize, to make amends before law enforcement got involved. The moment that broke the defense came when they played Dylan's secret recordings in court. My parents' voices filled the courtroom, laughing about my stupidity, planning their next moves, discussing how to maximize the theft before I noticed. My mother's voice calling me a cash cow who owed them for raising me. My father calculating how much more they could steal before my credit was completely destroyed. The jury heard them celebrating the successful BMW purchase with champagne while I was working a night shift to pay rent. Then came the psychiatric evaluation results. Both my parents had been examined by court-appointed professionals who found them competent to stand trial, but displaying severe narcissistic and antisocial personality traits. The psychiatrist testified that they showed no genuine remorse, only anger at being caught. Their inability to acknowledge the harm they'd caused suggested they would re-offend if given the opportunity. The evaluation destroyed any sympathy the jury might have felt for two elderly defendants. My mother made the fatal error of taking the stand against her attorney's advice. She wanted to tell her side, convinced she could manipulate the jury as she'd manipulated so many others. What followed was a masterclass in self-destruction. She portrayed herself as a loving mother, forced to extreme measures by an ungrateful daughter. She claimed I'd always been jealous of Dylan, that I'd refused to help the family despite having so much. When William asked her to define so much, she couldn't explain beyond a job and no children to support. The cross-examination revealed the real woman behind the motherly facade. William methodically walked her through each forged document, each lie told to family members, each dollar stolen, while I struggled to survive. Her mask slipped repeatedly, showing flashes of rage when contradicted contempt when discussing my little job and complete inability to acknowledge wrongdoing. When William asked if she felt any remorse for destroying my credit, she actually said, "Credit can be rebuilt. She's young." The jury's horror was visible. My father chose not to testify, but his presence spoke volumes. Throughout the trial, he'd maintained an expression of arrogant indifference, as if this was all beneath him. He'd smirk during testimony about my struggles, shake his head dismissively at evidence presentation. The jury saw it all, the man who'd raised me to value honesty and hard work, revealing himself as someone who valued neither. His attorney's attempts to humanize him fell flat against the weight of his obvious disdain for the proceedings. Closing arguments brought everything full circle. The defense made one last attempt to frame this as a family dispute blown out of proportion, suggesting probation and restitution would serve justice. They painted my parents as confused elderly people who'd made mistakes in trying to help their children, victims of a vindictive daughter and an overzealous prosecution. It was a performance that might have worked, if not for the mountain of evidence, showing calculated, systematic fraud spanning years. William's closing was a masterpiece of controlled fury. He walked the jury through the evidence one final time, not just the financial crimes, but the human cost. He showed photos of me in my nursing scrubs, working to help others, while my parents plotted to destroy me. He calculated the hours I'd worked to build my credit, the nights spent studying to earn my degree, the sacrifices made to create a stable life, all stolen by the people who should have been proudest of my achievements. He ended with a simple question. If parents can't be trusted to protect their children, who can? The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. As we waited in a conference room, I sat between James and Mrs. Chen, their presence anchoring me to the present. Ms. Rodriguez graded papers to pass time, occasionally reaching over to squeeze my hand. Agent Martinez popped in periodically with updates, her professional demeanor cracking occasionally to show genuine care for my well-being. These people who'd started as strangers had become my foundation, while my biological family had tried to destroy me. When the verdict came, we filed back into the courtroom for the last time. My parents sat rigid, their attorneys tense beside them. The jury foreman, the grandmother, raising her grandchild, stood to deliver the verdict. Guilty on all counts for both parents. Guilty on the conspiracy charges. Guilty on the wire fraud, the mail fraud, the identity theft. 43 times guilty for my mother. 43 times guilty for my father. The words rang out like bells of justice, each one lifting a weight I'd carried for too long. My mother's reaction was immediate and theatrical. She screamed that I'd destroyed the family, that I was an ungrateful child who'd forgotten everything they'd done for me. The bailiffs moved to contain her as she tried to lunge toward me, her carefully styled hair coming undone, her mask finally completely shattered. My father sat in stunned silence, the reality of consequences finally penetrating his armor of arrogance. Dylan, who'd been brought in to hear the verdict as part of his plea agreement, looked genuinely frightened for the first time in his life. Judge Harrison scheduled sentencing for 6 weeks later, but revoked bail immediately, citing my mother's outburst as evidence of potential violence. As they were led away in shackles, my mother still screaming about betrayal and ingratitude, I felt something I hadn't expected: peace. Not happiness, not satisfaction, just peace. The war was over. Truth had won. The rest was just paperwork and consequences, the inevitable conclusion to choices they'd made long before that first forged signature. 6 months after the trial, I stood in the entrance of Riverside General Hospital wearing my new badge. Iris Mitchell, RN, Head Nurse, Pediatric Unit. The promotion had come with recognition of not just my clinical skills, but my advocacy for vulnerable patients, inspired by my own experience of betrayal by those meant to protect me. The children I cared for, some escaping their own family traumas, found in me a nurse who understood that sometimes the real healing required more than medicine. The sentencing had delivered justice with a clarity that still sometimes took my breath away. My mother received 8 years in federal prison with no possibility of early release, the judge citing her complete lack of remorse and the psychological torture she'd inflicted through social media campaigns. My father got 7 years his age and health considered, but ultimately outweighed by the systematic nature of his crimes. Dylan received 2 years probation and 3,000 hours of community service, specifically working with identity theft victims to understand the impact of his actions. The restitution order totaled over $200,000 to be paid from the sale of their assets and future earnings. The house I'd grown up in, the swimming pool they'd installed with stolen money, the vacation property hidden in shell companies, all liquidated by federal marshals. The checks arrived monthly, each one a small victory, funding my new life, while they served their sentences. I'd never recouped the emotional costs, but financial justice helped build the foundation for moving forward. My grandmother's house had been my first major victory in reclaiming my life. The court had voided the fraudulent transfer, returning ownership to me as her will had intended. I'd spent weekends renovating it, with help from James and other survivors from our support group, transforming it from a rental property back into the home Grandma had envisioned. Her kitchen, where she'd taught me to bake, became the heart of monthly dinners for identity theft survivors, a place where stories were shared and healing happened over homemade meals. The nonprofit I'd founded, Phoenix Family Fraud Survivors, grew from those kitchen table conversations into a recognized organization. We provided resources, legal referrals, and most importantly, community for people discovering that their worst enemies shared their last names. The website I'd built featured survivor stories, warning signs of family financial abuse, and practical steps for protection and recovery. When the documentary about my case aired on national television, our membership tripled overnight, proof that my story was far from unique. James and I had evolved from fellow survivors to something deeper, though we'd taken it slowly, both of us carrying trust issues like scar tissue. Our first real date had been to a financial planning seminar, which had made us laugh at the absurdity while also feeling perfectly appropriate. He understood why I checked my credit report weekly, why certain phrases made me flinch, why family holidays required careful navigation. His proposal, a year after the trial, came with a prenuptial agreement he'd insisted on to protect us both, the most romantic legal document I'd ever seen. Max had not only recovered, but become a certified therapy dog, accompanying me to support group meetings where his presence provided comfort to people sharing their darkest moments. He seemed to understand which person needed him, most often settling beside someone on the verge of tears with the intuition animals possess for human pain. His vet bills, once a source of desperate fear, were now easily managed with my restored financial stability, though I still kept the card from the clinic that had helped me in crisis, as a reminder of kindness when I'd needed it most. Mrs. Chen had become the grandmother I'd thought I'd lost forever. She attended every milestone from my promotion ceremony to the nonprofit's official launch. Her guest house had long since ceased being my residence, but her kitchen table remained my refuge when the weight of survival felt heavy. She'd legally adopted me in a ceremony that made headlines, "Teacher adopts adult fraud victim." But for us, it was simply formalizing what the heart had already decided. Family was choice, and we'd chosen each other. The letters from prison came regularly, at first my parents maintaining their persecution complex even behind bars. I'd forward them unopened to my therapist, Dr. Williams, who specialized in trauma from family betrayal. She'd help me process the attempted manipulation without letting the poison penetrate. Over time, the letters decreased, then stopped entirely, my parents finally understanding that their power over me had ended the moment I'd chosen truth over family secrets. The silence felt like freedom. Dylan had surprised everyone by actually changing. The community service had placed him with elderly identity theft victims, forcing him to see the devastation from the other side. His supervisor reported that he'd broken down crying during his third week, finally understanding what he'd participated in. He'd written me a letter, not asking for forgiveness, but acknowledging the harm, accepting responsibility without excuse or manipulation. I'd read it once, filed it away, and focused on my own healing rather than his redemption journey. The ripple effects of standing up to my parents had spread throughout the extended family. Cousins came forward with their own stories of smaller thefts, manipulations that had been dismissed as misunderstandings. Uncle Robert flew in from Portland, and we spent a weekend comparing notes, finding healing and shared understanding. The family reunions that had once been stages for my parents' performances became genuine gatherings of survivors and supporters, the toxic elements excised like cancer from a body determined to heal. My work at the hospital had taken on new dimensions as I became known as someone who understood complex family dynamics. Social workers consulted me on cases involving financial abuse, recognizing that my lived experience offered insights their textbooks couldn't provide. I developed training modules for healthcare workers on recognizing signs of family financial exploitation, turning my trauma into education that could protect others. The hospital board had commended my advocacy, but the real reward came in preventing others from experiencing what I'd survived. The engagement party had been held in Grandma's backyard, the space transformed with lights and flowers, but maintaining the warmth of home. The guest list read like a roster of my survival: William and his mother, Ms. Rodriguez David and his wife Agent Martinez, now Sarah, a friend beyond her professional role, Uncle Robert, Aunt Grace, and dozens of support group members who'd become family. As I stood with James, surrounded by people who'd shown me that trust could be rebuilt, I thought about how differently this gathering looked from the family events of my childhood, poisoned by lies and greed. Speaking engagements had become a regular part of my life, sharing my story at conferences, universities, and community centers. The message was always the same. Family isn't a license to steal love, isn't measured in tolerance for abuse, and choosing yourself over toxic relationships isn't selfish but necessary. After each talk, people would approach with their own stories, finding courage in knowing they weren't alone, that survival was possible, even when the betrayal came from those who'd promised to protect you. The financial recovery had been steady, but symbolic of larger healing. My credit score had climbed back above 700 each point, representing hours of disputes documentation and rebuilding. The emergency fund I'd established would have seemed impossible during those nights in my car, but now provided security and peace. I'd even started investing something William had taught me, turning financial literacy into another form of armor against future exploitation. The girl who'd once rationed ramen could now donate to food banks, remembering hunger while helping others escape it. On a quiet Thursday evening, as I prepared dinner in Grandma's kitchen with Max at my feet and James reading at the table, my phone rang with an unknown number. Normally I wouldn't answer, but something made me pick up. It was Monica, her voice uncertain and small. She was in trouble. Her husband had drained their accounts and disappeared, and she didn't know where to turn. The old me might have felt satisfaction at this reversal, but the woman I'd become recognized another victim of betrayal. I gave her the nonprofit's number, told her about our next support group meeting, offered resources without offering personal forgiveness. Some bridges, once burned, couldn't be rebuilt, but that didn't mean I couldn't point her toward others who might help her cross her own troubled waters. When I hung up, James looked at me with the understanding that came from his own journey. "You did the right thing," he said simply, and I knew he meant both in helping her and in maintaining my boundaries. The documentary's success had brought unexpected opportunities, including a book deal that would turn my story into a resource for others. Writing it meant revisiting every painful moment, but this time, with the perspective of survival, each chapter ending, not with defeat, but with lessons learned. The advance would fund scholarships for identity theft victims, returning to school, their education interrupted by financial devastation. Full circle, from the girl who'd almost lost her nursing career to creating opportunities for others to rebuild their professional lives. As the sun set over Grandma's garden, now blooming with flowers she'd never gotten to plant but would have loved, I thought about the journey from that devastating bank call to this moment of peace. My parents had sought to destroy me for material gain, but instead had freed me from the obligation to love those who'd never truly loved me. They'd stolen my identity, but helped me discover who I really was. Not their victim, but my own hero, surrounded by chosen family who'd shown me that real love builds up rather than tears down. The final police report from their arrest had included an inventory of items found in their home photos of Dylan with his BMW receipts for luxury purchases, the notebook documenting their crimes. But buried in the evidence list was something that encapsulated their true nature, not a single photo of me after age 18, as if I'd ceased to exist once I couldn't be controlled. That absence meant to erase me had instead become my freedom. I existed now in the lives I'd touched, the people I'd helped, the family I'd chosen, and the future I was building on foundations of truth rather than blood. Tomorrow would bring new challenges at the hospital, another support group meeting, wedding planning with James, and the 1,000 small joys of a life reclaimed. My parents were serving their sentences, but I was serving notice that survival was possible, that family could be redefined, and that sometimes the most loving thing you could do for toxic people was to hold them accountable for their choices. The girl who'd once slept in her car now owned her grandmother's house. The woman whose credit had been destroyed now taught others to protect theirs. The daughter who'd been called selfish for wanting basic respect now knew that self-preservation wasn't just acceptable, but necessary. Looking back at that 28-year-old woman who'd answered a confusing bank call, I wanted to tell her that she was stronger than she knew, that the family she'd lose would be replaced by one she'd choose, that rock bottom would become the foundation for building higher than she'd ever imagined. But she'd had to live through it to believe it, just as everyone watching this had their own journeys, from victim to survivor to thriver. The stars were coming out over the garden, where Grandma had once told me I deserved better than crumbs of love. I'd finally learned to believe her, to feast at tables where I was valued rather than beg for scraps from those who saw me as nothing more than a resource to exploit. My parents had given me life, but had tried to steal it back penny by penny. Their greatest crime hadn't been the money, but the betrayal of trust. Their greatest failure was underestimating the daughter they'd raised to work hard and never give up. In trying to destroy me, they'd forged me into someone unbreakable. As we cleared the dinner dishes, James asked if I ever regretted taking the legal route rather than just walking away. I thought about the question, about the months of pain the trial had required, the public humiliation, the family relationships that would never recover. Then I thought about the emails I got weekly from other survivors who'd found courage in my story, the laws being changed to protect victims, the awareness growing that family could be the most dangerous predator of all. No regrets, I told him, meaning it completely. They made their choices, I made mine. The only difference is that I can live with mine. The house settled around us with the comfortable sounds of home. Max's gentle snoring, the dishwasher humming the wind chimes Grandma had hung decades ago, still singing in the evening breeze. Somewhere, my parents were in their cells, perhaps finally understanding that actions had consequences. Dylan was working off his community service, hopefully building the character they'd never taught him. But here in this kitchen, where love had always lived, I was exactly where I belonged, home safe and free. My story began with parents who used my trust to buy my brother a car. It ended with me understanding that the price of that betrayal had been my freedom from obligations to people who'd never truly seen me as anything more than a resource. They'd stolen my money but given me clarity. They'd destroyed my credit but built my character. They'd tried to erase my future but had instead written me a new one, authored by my own choices rather than their greed. To everyone watching who's trapped in their own family financial nightmare, wondering if they're overreacting, if blood really is thicker than water, if staying silent is better than speaking truth, you deserve better. Your feelings are valid. Their relationship to you doesn't give them the right to rob you. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can say to family is, no more. The path from victim to survivor isn't easy, but it's possible. I'm living proof. If this story resonated with you, if you've experienced family financial abuse, or know someone who has, please share this video. Your story matters even if you're not ready to tell it yet. Leave a comment about boundaries you've had to set, or red flags you've learned to recognize. Every shared experience helps someone else realize they're not alone in this struggle. Like this video if you believe that family isn't a license to steal, and subscribe to hear more stories of survival and triumph over those who mistake trust for weakness. Thank you for joining me on this journey from betrayal to justice to healing. Remember that choosing yourself isn't selfish when others have already chosen to harm you. Real family, the kind that matters, is built on respect, trust, and genuine love, not shared DNA and stolen credit. May you find the strength to protect yourself and the wisdom to know that you deserve nothing less than relationships that build you up rather than tear you down. Until next time, stay strong, stay smart, and never apologize for demanding the respect you've always deserved.